Aeginetan, whose name was Lampon. He was the son of Pythias and a person of the first rank among his countrymen. Now this Lampon went about the same time to Pausanias and counseled him to do a deed of exceeding wickedness. Son of Cleombrotus, he said very earnestly, what thou hast already done is passing great and glorious. By the favor of heaven thou hast saved Greece and gained a renown beyond all the Greeks of whom we have any knowledge. Now then, so finish thy work, that thine own fame may be increased thereby, and that henceforth barbarians may fear to commit outrages on the Grecians. When Leonidas was slain at Thermopylae, Xerxes and Mardonius commanded that he should be beheaded and crucified. Do thou the like at this time by Mardonius, and thou wilt have the glory of Sparta, and likewise to the whole of Greece, for by hanging him upon a cross thou wilt avenge Leonidas, who was thy father's brother. Thus spake Lampon, thinking to please Pausanias. But Pausanias answered him, My Aeginetan friend, for thy foresight and thy friendliness I am much beholden to thee, but the counsel which thou hast offered is not good. First hast thou lifted me up to the skies by the praise of my country and my achievement, and then thou hast cast me down to the ground by bidding me maltreat the dead, and saying that thus I shall raise myself in men's esteem. Such doings befit barbarians rather than Greeks, and even in barbarians we detest them. On such terms, then, I could not wish to please the Aeginetans, nor those who think as they think. Enough for me to gain the approval of my own countrymen, and by righteous deeds as well as by righteous words. Leonidas, whom thou wouldst have me avenge, is, I maintain, abundantly avenged already. Surely the countless lives here taken are enough to avenge not him only, but all those who fell at Thermopylae. Come not thou before me again with such a speech, nor with such counsel, and thank my forbearance that thou art not now punished. Then Lampon, having received this answer, departed and went his way.
That's the very, very famous passage that comes at the very near the end of the last book of the Persian Wars. We've gone from the first book where we talked last time about definition of history to the very end of the Persian Wars, and that is a summary, we would say, of the or it is it's an incident, an event, and an action that strikes the central note of the whole of Herodotus' histories. There, you can see clearly. We talked about the fact that this is a world war, in the sense that it's a war for, not only in the sense that it's a war for the control of the world, the political control of the world, but that the fate of the world hangs in balance in this war. That is, whether the world will be one way or the other, whether it will be a Persian world or whether it will be a Greek world, whether it would be a world dominated by the Persian vision of life, or whether it would be the one that in fact it has been, that is the one that is dominated by what we call Western view of life. This sums up the opposition of East and West. The counsel that is offered here is something that contradicts the very principle of the Greeks and of civilization itself. It's for this reason that the Persians are called barbarians. It involves, for one thing, it involves dishonoring the dead. And that is an unspeakable crime in the eyes, an unspeakable evil in the eyes of Leonidas.
In a way, that passage does sum up, doesn't it, the whole of the great and most significant events. That is, we jumped from the first sentence of the book almost to the last. That is, to the last few chapters here. This passage that was just read is from the last few pages. But in between lies this whole great story. Now, Herodotus spends books 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 really all beside the point, or anyway, preparing the way. But then in the last books of 6, 7, 8, 9, he really gets to the point of it, and that's this issue that you're talking about. That is the confrontation between East and West, and it really happens essentially in a few battles. They are called decisive battles of the world. And you remember that famous book, 15 Decisive Battles of the World?
Yeah.
I think of the 15 decisive battles of the world, 4 of them are Greek. It's there they are, right at the beginning of our history. How do they go? The first one was the Battle of Marathon. Darius brought over a vast army and tried to conquer Greece. He was stopped surprisingly at Marathon and got discouraged, thought it wasn't worth it, and turned around and went home. That was in 490. These dates are important, and they're quite easy to remember. The Battle of Marathon, 490 BC. 10 years later, Xerxes musters his great army and sets forth to avenge that. And Xerxes was slowed down at Thermopylae.
Just about 10 years later.
10 years later. 10 years later. 480. 480. And that same year, or same month, as a matter of fact, there was a sea battle also at Salamis, so that Thermopylae and Salamis happened within a few weeks, months of each other. And then the next year was the final decisive battle of Plataea, and that's the one that Pausanias was the general of, and it's after that battle that this proposition came. It's really not very complicated. You only have to remember 4 great names. Marathon, which we all know from the famous race. Thermopylae, which we all know because it itself just is such a dramatic battle.
Thermopylae in the 300, that's what you
300
those who died.
men who died there
Spartans.
and sacrificed their lives, and they all were killed, but they slowed that army down enough so that Salamis, the sea battle, could take place where their fleet was destroyed. And with that double take, Persian fleet was destroyed. Xerxes tried once more. Actually, Mardonius was left alone to try once more. Xerxes went home after the defeat at Salamis, but his general Mardonius still thought that with the land army he could defeat the Greeks, and he tried once more at Plataea, and that's the last of the 4. And it was after that battle, Mardonius was killed in the battle. It was after that battle that Lampon came to the victorious Pausanias, the Spartan, and said, "You crucify him and hang his body up there on the cross and throw his head to the wolves," because that's what he did to the great Leonidas at the Battle of Thermopylae 10 years ago. And this is the great response. Pausanias says, no, that's an evil counsel. We do not do that. We are Greeks. We are not barbarians. And with that, really, the book is concluded. Again, Rawlinson, the 19th century translator, has a note at the end of the whole book, and he says, it's often said that Herodotus never finished his history, that if he could have gone on, but he said he certainly concluded it. I think that's a very good distinction. He didn't finish it, but he concluded it. That is the moral point of the book really has been made. And that's a great passage. And it's come down to us, and it's still a great passage. Today, aren't we tempted? Here we are today. What's the greatest problem in military history today? If you listen to the radio or the television or you read the newspapers, what's the big problem? The taking of hostages, assassination. What do we call all that kind of warfare? Terrorism. Yeah, I was groping for the word.
Torture.
Terrorism.
Torture is another one of the things that we find. We hear people talk about the violation of human rights. They're mostly talking about kidnapping and murder and terrorism.
Terrorism is a good word, isn't it? Because that's exactly what was practiced by Mardonius.
Yes, well, he's saying that that's part of his argument, you remember. He says, well, if you do this, then people will fear the Greeks from then on. They will not dare to attack you again if you do this. And that was part of the reason, part of the strategy for these actions. Actually, it was part of also simply an impulsive action on the part of Xerxes. When it's done, Xerxes is mad with rage. It's a kind of fit. Xerxes was a man who was subject to these fits of insane rage.
The streak of madness. Cambyses went completely mad.
Yes.
And Xerxes is certainly touched by it.
Yes. He's on the edge all the time. And it says at the point where he does that, where he commands that act to be done, that he is in a kind of insane rage.
At Leonidas.
Yes.
Because he hated that heroism. He hated that. In fact, he couldn't understand it.
Yeah.
That 300 men would give their lives in what would seem to be a useless cause. He was baffled by the Greeks, as a matter of fact. Xerxes was all along. He couldn't understand why they put up such resistance.
Yeah, when he had counsel against fighting the Spartans, his counselors said to him, "You don't know what you're getting into," and he simply could not imagine soldiers like the Spartans. He could not imagine that ideal, we would say, that ideal of nobility and courage and of self-sacrifice. Those are not qualities that are known really, or are characteristic, let us say, of the Persian.
Well, we just had a momentary interruption, but I was trying to recall, and I needed a moment to recall it anyway, this story of Thermopylae, which of all these battles is the most dramatic. 300 Spartans and a smaller number of Thebans remained under the command of Leonidas simply as a holding action in this narrow pass between the mountains and the sea. And to keep that great army, that thousands, Herodotus says there were 300,000 or some incredible number. The historians dispute just how many it was. He says that it was an incredible number who were held off by just 300 and a few more people. And after this battle was over, the Thebans, who had helped the Spartans and were among those slain at Thermopylae, set up a festival in honor of this victory in the city of Thebes. And the festival was dedicated to Zeus, the god of freedom. And there were games celebrated there, much like the Olympic Games. They were the Eleutherian Games. And the word Eleutherian, it means lover of freedom, and Zeus, God, is the god of freedom. In my youth, in our youth, Mr. Quinn and I, when we were in college, World War II was being fought, ended, and we were of that generation of the GI Bill that came into college after the war. And for 10 years, during those years when we were in college, wouldn't you say this is true? There was one theme. It was freedom. That's all you heard about. That is, philosophers wrote books on freedom. What did Aristotle think of freedom? What did Immanuel Kant think of freedom? Literary men wrote books about Shakespeare and freedom, or freedom in Greek tragedy, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, many of the Western civilization programs that began back in those days were the main theme of the whole program was freedom. They draw that out. They pick out the works of the great authors, and they would read and talk about those passages, so that it seemed to be the main theme of Western civilization.
I mean, certainly, all the while we were in school, that was the inspiration, and without our realizing it very much, that certainly has changed. That is, today, I think you have to say the theme is peace. That is, in the political order. And it frequently gets identified with slavery. I think I mentioned on one of these tapes John Lennon's famous record, "Nothing to Die For," nothing to fight for. He called it, just imagine what a wonderful world would be if all the world were at peace and we really had nothing to fight for. Well, that is a complete overturn of the theme of our youth, which had to do really with Herodotus. It had to do with this fight that happened at Marathon, at Thermopylae, at Salamis, and at Plataea. It had to do not only with East and West, but again, one could almost think of it in those terms, but it didn't occur in those terms, but it did occur in terms of freedom versus slavery. That is, the whole theme of the Second World War was we cannot submit to slavery. Winston Churchill made a career out of it. I mean, that was the theme of all of his orations. And General de Gaulle, fighting for freedom. They called the Free French, or they call themselves freedom fighters. This whole theme is right here at the beginning of the history of Western civilization. The Persians were a great people. Herodotus certainly doesn't underestimate their greatness. Quite the contrary, he celebrates it. But it was a greatness that had to do with the lordship of slaves. Whereas Leonidas and here Pausanias, this has to do with the governance of a free people. And that's really the distinction that Pausanias makes. That is, he said, I can't act like a barbarian because I'm not like that. I'm not a warlord. I am, in a way, an elected official. I'm a man who is the captain over a free people.
Yeah, well, the Persian monarch, all of the Persian monarchs, and all of the monarchs of the East were tyrants. Now, some of them were rather benevolent tyrants. Cyrus was, for example. But they were all brought up in the same tradition of tyranny. They were really what Plato had in mind in the Republic when he was talking about tyranny. Of course, he was afraid that Greece was going to fall, that Athens was going to fall into tyranny, and there was some danger of it falling into tyranny at that time, and tyrants did indeed arise. But the model for the tyrant was the Eastern potentate, the man of power, of unlimited power. You remember, I don't think we mentioned this, you remember the book of Esther in the Bible, where there is King Ahasuerus. Many times, I believe that some scholars identify Ahasuerus with Xerxes. But that's the name, the way the name is pronounced. Ahasuerus, that's the way you find it, at least in the versions of the Bible that I know. And you remember the behavior of Ahasuerus. His wife doesn't please him. His wife refuses to come to see him. One of his wives. He has many wives. That's kind of characteristic of him. He has many, many wives. And the chief of his wives refuses to come to him, and so he has her killed. He just orders her killed immediately. And Esther instead comes before him and becomes his wife. And but all the way through the story,
but she pleases him.
She pleases him,
and he's very nice.
Yes, yes.
I mean, yes. This cruelty is coupled sometimes with all kinds of other virtues.
Oh, with a great generosity,
yeah, right.
For example. Yes, exactly. He is finally persuaded, you remember, to spare the whole Jewish nation.
Because he becomes one of the emblems of the good tyrant.
Exactly, because of the wishes for. But you see, everything depends upon his word, his whim. Whatever he decides becomes immediately law. If he writes down on a piece of paper that the Jews must be killed, all of them, well, that's it. There is nothing that can be done. He can't even, it's only with the greatest difficulty that he can even change his own word about a thing. Once he's said it, it's been said. He really has something of the status of a god. The Persian or Eastern potentate, his power is unlimited. And he often acts on impulse and does terribly cruel things on impulse. And then on the other hand, he will be perfectly benign and reasonable and as I say, even enormously generous.
I mean, you do get to like these in Herodotus. You get to like these men, Xerxes and Darius.
Yes,
they have I think we pointed this out before. Almost a childishness about them. It's as if they hadn't got to the age of reason.
Yeah, Xerxes, he wants to understand the Greeks. He really does. He goes to his counselor and he says, well, tell me about this again. Explain this to me again. I don't get it.
These foolish people who fight for something they call freedom, he doesn't know what that is.
No, he's never heard of it.
He's heard of terror, and he got to power by it, and yes. He rules by it, and he would be, I can't say content, but he would be satisfied if somebody worked the same thing on him.
Yes.
As, for example, Croesus is quite safied to become a slave.
Yeah.
In a way,
yes, he does.
In a way, he sees the justice of it.
Yeah.
But the idea of freedom is something far too. That notion of reaching the age of reason, just as in persons there is an age of reason before which you're a child or an infant. History reaches an age of reason, and it reached the age of reason with the Greeks. Now, of course, this is, I can hear some of our colleagues at the university saying, there they go again, making ridiculous statements. But there is certainly a sense in which this is true. Sweeping generalizations, after all, that's what generalizations are for. The Greeks invented reason. Now, everyone admits that they invented science. Everyone admits that they invented tragedy or that they invented the epic. But I really think you can sweep the generalization further. They really conceived the world as a reasonable place. And there isn't any evidence that anyone else ever did.
No. Now, you can say that, of course, if you just read Herodotus, you will say, well, I can see that Darius and Xerxes and Cambyses are reasonable men sometimes, but that's not what we mean. Of course, they're human beings, and as human beings, they have reason. Yeah. They're the rational.
But they haven't reached the age of that reason yet.
No.
That is, they act like children. They act on impulse. They act on the basis of rage, on the basis of sudden infatuation, on the basis of affection. They're governed by their emotions, not by their reason.
So you remember the book of Judith. You remember how Judith manages to kill the great emperor by appealing to his vices, as a matter of fact. But that's typical. They're enormously strong men. They have unlimited power, and yet they're very weak men because they're so easily led by their own passions. They're not under the control of reason. See, as you read Herodotus, you will find really very few examples, if any. None come to my mind of the great Greeks involved in the story who are simply carried away by passions and led to their destruction by that means. But in a way, that is the story of the Persians. One of the things to remember, to think about as you reflect on this book, go back and ask yourself about how succession to the throne worked through these great emperors. And it's a rather complicated business, and I don't even remember all the details. But
I remember and forget it a million times. It's so complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated, but so often
it's not reasonable.
So often it isn't merely the son inheriting the throne from the father.
Intrigue.
It's intrigue, these complex intrigues. Well, it started right at the beginning of the book. You remember with the fall, it had to do with the predicted fall of the empire of Croesus, ultimately, and it all had to do with one of the emperors who was so proud, so vain of his wife's beauty that he wanted his chief counselor to spy on his wife when she took off her clothes in the bedroom, and he did that, and she saw him spying on her, and the advisor, the counselor, explained to her that the king had made him do this, and she said, "Then kill the king." So he kills the king.
That's Gyges.
Gyges, yes, Gyges.
Plato mentions
Gyges, right.
Famous ring.
Yeah. Well, you see, it's a little bit like Gyges because he's concealed. He can see something that he's not supposed to see in secret, And she says to him, she's so enraged at this betrayal of her honor that she has Gyges kill the king, and then he becomes the emperor, and that starts a long train of betrayals and intrigue. But you say, well, that's the way all politics really is, and it often involves killing your own brother, your own relatives,
because they're the ones who are your rivals.
Yes, they're your rivals. So you get this inter-family strife and murder as a way of political life. Now that's not made up. That's just a fact.
But it's the norm.
It's the norm.
And the Greeks are the only ones who ever discovered any other way of doing it. Now, we don't mean to say that the Greeks always acted reasonably. We don't mean to say that they lived up to the principles that they discovered. They didn't, and as a matter of fact, they destroyed themselves and sunk back pretty much into the same thing. But for a short time, a couple of 100 years, let's say, it's almost as if a great curtain were raised on the stage of history. And for a couple of 100 years, the Greeks stood out as this most remarkable people. They discovered reason, and it like a light. Everything they did was illuminated by it. Their personal lives, their literature, their architecture, their the way they laid out their cities. Everything was illuminated by reason. And their politics.
And their religion.
Religion.
Yes.
That
is,
the gods changed.
The gods changed.
Zeus, lover of freedom.
Right.
Imagine celebrating a god who loved freedom. Yeah.
Because the gods, of course, were the worst tyrants. The gods were those upon whom the Persian potentates modeled themselves. The gods didn't obey reason. They were completely beyond. They were irrational beings who might do anything, totally arbitrary, you say, sheer creatures of will and power and force. And remember, these are the same gods. That is, the gods of the Greeks are the same gods. That is, they have the same names. That is, they've translated into Greeks, but they're identifiably the same gods that you find worshipped throughout that part of the world by everyone. So that when a person went from one nation to another, they said, well, I see you worship the same gods we do. But that really wasn't true.
You call it was Aphrodite Isis.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's really Aphrodite.
Yeah, they're really the same. And modern mythologists, mythographers or mythologists, whatever you want to call them, have gone, as people who study myths, have gone back and looked at those, and very often they have exaggerated the similarities. They have studied how these gods are the same, how they are present in all of these cultures. I find very often without due regard to the profound difference of the Greek gods from all the others. They clearly have become the gods of reason.
Plato, of course, goes so far as to criticize the gods. One of the charges against Socrates, and one of the reasons why he was executed, was charge of impiety. And the origin of that charge may well have been that he did invent theology. That is, again, what is theology? It's applying reason to the gods, which was not done in the Orient at all. But it's Plato who raises the question, or Socrates, and Plato writes it down. The gods must be good. They can't be just arbitrary. There must be something wrong. You remember in the Republic, Socrates submits Homer to a theological criticism. These gods act on impulse, they act on emotion. That can't be true, he says, if they're really gods. Because gods would have to be reasonable beings. They are pure mind. They therefore would have to operate on the basis of reason.
Yeah, they have to be wise. They are wise.
And that would follow that they would be good. That they would be concerned with truth. Remember, he says they couldn't lie. Socrates is much disturbed that in the gods in Homer tell lies, and he says that's a blasphemy. The gods couldn't tell lies; they would have to be ordered toward the truth and toward the good. Well, that's the Greek mind at work, and you just don't find that anywhere else in the world. And it is, as we've said so many times, the preparation for Christianity, because when God is revealed in Christianity, it all falls into place. Well, of course, he's good. God is not an Oriental despot. God cannot do anything evil. God is good. He is goodness itself. He is truth itself. Those are ideas which we as Christians pretty much take for granted. They are revealed in the Old Testament, but they're revealed darkly. It took the light of theology to draw that out and to make it clear to the human race. And that's the function of Greece. You may say that the role that Greece plays in the providential history of the world, of the human race, is this coming of the age of reason. That's what the Greeks did.
The first converts to Christianity were the civilized peoples of the world. That is, they were the Greeks and the Romans. It was through Rome, especially Rome, that Christianity spread through the world. They were the first targets for conversion. And it was of course a tremendous change that was required, a real conversion. But the groundwork, sometimes we call this the prolegomena for the faith, was already present in them in their confidence in reason, which they had in turn got from Greeks.
This is why we read these books. That is really, we want to come at the faith historically.
Yeah.
We want to come at it the way the world came at it, and the way that we come at it really in our own lives. There is such a thing as a childish faith. But you remember St. Paul, when he talks about being a little child, he says expressly, I want you to be as a child in innocence, but not in intelligence, not in mind. And he makes it very clear that the Christian advice to be as a child, which Christ himself, of course, gives, unless you become as little children, you shall not see the kingdom of heaven. But St. Paul expressly says, now that means that you shall be as a child is in innocence, not committing sin. But it does not mean, quite the contrary. He says, you remember, when I was a child, I thought as a child, but now I have come. How does that go? I can't remember the exact words. Now, he doesn't say reach the age of reason, but he says something very much like it. And that distinction is of enormous importance, because I think among sentimental Christians, you hear that mistake made all the time. Oh, let's be as children. I don't want to think. I don't want to study theology.
It's taken to be an anti-intellectual kind of injunction when it's not at all. It's not at the contrary. The gods of the Greek, of the Persians, or of the Eastern potentate were not only were they not good, but they were positively evil. You can be positively evil. They were evil beings who did and commanded evil things. The chief of these is always singled out as human sacrifice. That was the practice, once again, that you find in the Old Testament among the people around the Jews, that human sacrifice was the norm, was the rule, and it was commanded by the gods.
Even cannibalism. Yeah. Because a sacrifice is usually a sacrificial banquet.
Yeah.
And so there it was. And we find it, and these terrible stories of serving children up to fathers at meals, these terrifying cannibalistic tales. All of this, it's a frightful world, and yet sometimes a beautiful world too.
Yeah. You find those things in Greek mythology, those stories, but then that becomes
that's the stuff, though. That's the matter.
Yeah.
Isn't it? That is, those stories are the matter of Greek tragedy.
Yes.
But the form is reason.
Well, right, and it's that is there especially those stories of eating one's own children often by mistake. And it goes back to some evil act among the gods themselves, which is punished. It's held into a horrible thing, and that's the beginning of the curse on the house of Atreus, for example. That's what the whole curse on the house of Atreus goes back to, some horrible act in the past. They're not things that they're recognized.
But that story ends with the establishment of the law court of justice, of Athena and the court of justice, holding up the scales. I don't know. Are we going to go into that or not? We don't know yet. We'll have to think about it.
We might. I do think
we might read those plays.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing.
The great trilogy of Aeschylus is about this exact question. A great play of that house, and it has to do with a background of unspeakable crime. The first play begins with the sacrifice of Iphigenia at Aulis by Agamemnon as the Greeks set out for the Trojan War.
It's in revenge for that act that Clytemnestra turns against her husband and eventually has and participates in the murder of her husband, and that in turn begets the
Her
revenge
son
of
kills
her own son, and then
and there's no end to this. It's an infinite series of vengeances until at the end of the play, so dramatically, and critics have pointed out, really, it doesn't obey the inner unity of form of a play. It's something almost external. It comes from the sky.
Yeah, it's
a gift of the gods.
Deus ex machina,
Right,
they call it.
right.
The god, the goddess Athena comes down, and she says, "I'm going to settle this thing once and for all. We're not going to go on and on and on like this, because the next question is whether the son is going to be
he has to be killed because he killed his mother, because she killed her husband, because he killed the daughter, and Athena cuts the knot by a revelation. That is, it is a divine intervention.
Well, it's even a trial. There's a trial is conducted, and both sides are presented, and the result of the trial is a hung jury. It's a tie. It's a tie vote, and therefore Athena herself has to break the tie. So it is done by a divine intervention.
And that play is a dramatic representation of what Herodotus is talking about here in real history. That we are not like the barbarians. We are different, and it is the rule of reason that governs us.
Once again, what Mardonius is urging is an act of revenge, not an act of justice. They're different things.
Mardonius is the chorus. Lampon is urging.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
He's named.
Yeah. Right. Lampon proposes this revenge. That is, and it's a never-ending cycle. You see, once you begin revenge, where you're not really talking about justice anymore. You see, justice has been done. Mardonius is dead. The war has been brought to a successful conclusion. Mardonius was wrong, and he has been defeated, and that's the end of it. Now, if you carry it beyond that, you get into the realm of what is called cruelty. That is, when you go beyond justice in punishment, then you enter into cruelty. When you abuse a dead body, when you try to get further revenge on someone who has already paid the supreme price, you see, which is death. That's all that can be given is death. When you go beyond that, then you get into the realm of horror. When you go beyond justice, then you get into cruelty, you get into torture. That is, you don't simply want to kill your enemy, you want to prolong the suffering of your enemy. That's what's involved in torture.
You know, we could give an examination in this little course, and a good question would be, what's the chief, in the literature we've read so far, what is the chief example of injustice? And everybody will flunk. But it turns out to be the desecration of the body. I was just reminded of something quite obvious, and I wonder if everybody's forgotten it who's listening to this tape.
Yeah, well, that was my.
Was that in your mind?
I was on my way to that.
Yeah. I mean, let's not tell them. But there is a certain work of literature which we've already covered, which deals precisely with this question, and it is the turning point there as it is here.
Yes. Well, this is very often when this point is made about cruelty and versus reason, justice versus cruelty, impiety in warfare, for example. The case very often, the reply often is given, well, but examples of that happen all the time on both sides in wars. There's always cruelty in war. People in war, even though they may be on the right side, they may be on the just side, they may be unjust men, they behave cruelly to war. And of course, we have to say yes, that's true. But that isn't the point. That isn't the point at all.
You remember so much was made of the infamous Sergeant Calley, was that his name?
That's right. That's right.
During the Vietnamese War, because he machine gunned innocent people in the village. And so you see, we're worse than the communists. We have these villains on our side.
Yeah. They said, well, the reason that happened, this is part of the defense, was that those innocent people in the villages were carrying hand grenades under their clothes.
They armed the children.
They armed the children. And that's not fair. I mean, that's not fair warfare according to our standards. They did all sorts of things in that war that they say, civilians don't engage in warfare. Now, you could never tell whether a civilian was an innocent civilian or whether they were really unarmed. I mean, it didn't matter whether they were women or children. That had nothing to do with it.
The women in warfare, it's just a horror.
Yeah.
There they were.
There they were, and you just say, well, under those circumstances, the danger is, see, this is precisely the danger. That is, when the other side is using these tactics, then there's always the danger that your side will be tempted to use the same tactics. You say, well, all right, if you're going to play the game that way, if you're going to play dirty, then we're going to.
Good was, and what Socrates says good is. You remember Thrasymachus had said good is simply power. That is, good is whatever I want and I have the power to get. And Socrates says, well, suppose you had Gyges' ring. Now, suppose you could make yourself invisible and you could do anything you wanted. You then would be the most powerful man on earth. But isn't it true that if you were a good man, you would still act rightly, justice?
I think actually that story is told by, it's after Thrasymachus, right after Thrasymachus.
Told by one of the boys.
One of the boys.
Yes.
He says, well, now Thrasymachus,
Glaucon,
I think he's the one that tells the story. He says, now I want to propose this to you. What would you say about this, Socrates? That what people say, he says, well, Thrasymachus didn't defend himself very well, but other people do a better job than he did. And what they say is, well, people are virtuous, apparently.
Only because they don't get caught.
Yeah, only because they don't get caught, and they behave virtuously before the world. But if you just gave them Gyges' ring, and they could turn it around and be invisible, then would they really be virtuous? He said that would be the real test.
Aren't we all crooks?
Yes.
It's just we're afraid that we'll be caught.
Yes.
And Socrates draws that out. It's a beautiful
that's
illustration,
a good example.
And it's taken, as it were, from Herodotus. It's taken out of this history, and there it is. And the Greeks, as a people, took it out of the history of the human race and presented it to our eyes. That is there such a thing as right and wrong? And if there is such a thing as right, then it must be exercised, especially when we have power, especially after we've won the war. That notion of proscribing the enemy. You win the war, what do? Burn their cities. You put all of their youth into slavery. You debauch their wives. You destroy their temples. Is that what you do? No. After you've won, what you do is treat the people you've conquered in such a way that they respect you and honor you and love you. In other words, you set them free and treat them as a free people. With all of our faults, good old United States. Isn't that what we did to Japan? General MacArthur imitated Pausanias. He didn't execute the emperor. Now they did with the Germans. There were those trials, and history is going to have to go over that as to whether that was right.
Yeah, that was a controversial matter. That was a very controversial matter. I remember at the time that there were people who felt very strongly that that was wrong. They said, well, they have been punished. We won the war. They've lost. And many of them have been killed in the war, and you can't do that.
The argument was that the Nazis were particularly heinous, and therefore deserved a kind of punishment beyond death, as it were. And as I say, in the long run, I think we will look back on that as something contrary to Greek reason. But let's say, aside from that, aside from the Nuremberg trials, and there were some Japanese. The prime minister, I think, was executed, wasn't he? Tojo, I think he was. I'm not sure, but I think there were some, perhaps few, of the Japanese warlords. But the idea was that they had gone beyond the usual war crimes and had committed atrocities beyond the normal.
Yeah.
But putting that in a kind of a bracket, because I do think history is going to judge us rather severely there. The principle that the Greek raises here is this. The purpose of war is not the extermination of the enemy, but setting him free, bringing him into the order of civilization. Not to treat him in such a way that 20 and 30 years later he's going to grow up with hatred of you and a desire to take revenge on you.
Yes.
Because revenge creates revenge, creates revenge.
Well, it doesn't bring peace.
Doesn't bring peace.
The object of war ultimately is peace. And if you merely create new animosities, or you perpetuate animosities through acts of revenge, then you are simply preparing the next generation for another war. Some people feel and argue that the very severe punishments of the Germans after World War I were the ultimate cause of World War II. Now that may or may not be true, but it's a possible argument.
It's arguable, and it certainly raises this question. That is, the purpose of war, as you said, is peace, and the peace is, Augustine's famous words, is the tranquility of order. That is, it's not just simply the imposition of power. It has to do with what's really there. It has to do, in other words, with what reason perceives, which after all is what order is. That's the difference, isn't it? Chaos and order, the difference is reason. And the Greeks introduced that principle. We haven't always lived up to it, let's put it that way, but the principle has been there in Western civilization ever since the Greeks established it.
Yes, well, it's very much like saying that the principle of virtue has been present there. But it doesn't mean that everyone in Western civilization has been virtuous, but it simply, and indeed there have been outbreaks of terrible abuses, of terrible outbreaks of evil, but it hasn't extinguished the principle. The principle has always abided in Western civilization, and does so still.
Now, there's one other theme that ends the book on the very, very last paragraph. This is the one that led Rawlinson to make the comment. He says, the work of Herodotus, though not finished throughout, is concluded. And this is on the very last page of the book, the very last paragraph of the book. After the whole thing is over, in the next to last paragraph, very short, this done, they sailed back to Greece, carrying with them, besides other treasures, the shore cables from the bridges of Xerxes, which they wished to dedicate in their temples. And this was all that took place that year. The Greeks defeated the Persians. The Persians went home, and the Greeks sailed all the way to Abydos, there where Xerxes had first built that bridge across the Hellespont, and they took the cables as a trophy and hung it up in their temples as a sign that they had broken that bridge between East and West. We'd remarked on this before, that the East tried to build a bridge to the West by conquering it. And the West has tried to build many bridges the other way, as the British Empire, for example. The West has tried to conquer the East. In every case, those bridges have been broken. According to the prophecies of the Bible, of course, we know that the only one who is ever going to build that bridge successfully is going to be the Antichrist. That is, we'll not have one world until the end of the world. That is, the complete unity of the world will only be achieved in the last days, and it will be achieved by the villain. It will be achieved by the arch enemy of man. And of God. Now, of course, after that, there will be then a reign of peace, and there will be one world, and that will be a Christian world. But the history will always be this fight. That is, as long as we have not got to the very last days, we will see the world in terms really of this history of East and West. And then in the very last paragraph, I don't know as I read the whole thing, but someone comes, a story is told. Herodotus has finished his history. That is, the book ends really with, and that was all that took place that year. And then he adds this commentary, and it goes back to a story about Cyrus, all the way back to Cyrus. There's no transition, and it's rather a confusing thing to read.
Yes.
It was the grandfather of this Artaetes, one Artembares by name, who suggested to the Persians a proposal which they readily embraced, and thus urged upon Cyrus. Quote, "Since Jove, they said, has overthrown Astyages and given the rule to the Persians, and to thee chiefly, O Cyrus, come now, let us quit this land wherein we dwell, for it is a scant land and a rugged, and let us choose ourselves some other better country. Many such lie around us, some near us, some further off. If we take one of these, men will admire us far more than they do now. Who that had the power would not so act? And when shall we have a fairer time than now, when we are lords of so many nations and rule all Asia?" And then Cyrus, who did not greatly esteem the counsel, told them that they might do so if they liked, but he warned them not to expect in that case to continue to be rulers, but to prepare for being ruled by others. Soft countries give birth to soft men. There was no region which produced very delightful fruits and at the same time men of a warlike spirit. So the Persians departed with altered minds, confessing that Cyrus was wiser than they, and chose rather to dwell in a churlish land and exercise lordship than to cultivate plains and be the slaves of others. And it's there that Rawlinson makes the comment, well, this book may not end, but it certainly concludes. That is a marvelously Greek ending. That is, it has that spontaneity, that sense of complete surprise. It drives us back to one of the other themes which is throughout this book. That is, what was it? Why did the Greeks win? It was because they were poor. They were not glutted with luxury. That magnitude that we talked about in the very first lecture that we gave on Herodotus. Didn't we talk about magnitude?
Yes,
we must have been.
Yeah.
It's so conspicuous. This great size of Xerxes' army, 300,000 men against what? 300 Spartans. That is that poverty, that austerity of the Greeks. They were a rugged people. They lived in a rugged country, a small country. They lived a hard life.
If you look at at Greece, just look at Greece on the map. If you can find it, If it isn't marked plainly and you don't know the geography there in the Mediterranean or the Aegean Sea very well, you may have a little trouble locating Greece on a map of that area because it's so insignificant in size. If you look across the Aegean and you look at Turkey, you can find that all right. It's a vast nation in area.
The Union of Soviet Socialist
Oh,
Republics.
look at that! You won't have any trouble finding that.
It stretches all the way to the sea.
But Greece is a tiny little land. You can imagine that's pretty much what Xerxes thought. He said, Greece. What is this Greece? Who's ever heard of Greece?
You always see Xerxes peering. He sits on his throne and who's that down there?
Yeah.
He can't quite focus on this tiny little
You can
place.
see the thousands of ships and the thousands of men of his own. They're easy. They fill up the world. But when he looks for the Greeks, he says, well, I've never heard of these people. And it's even more than the Greeks. It's the Spartans.
Who are the Greek of the Greeks?
Yes, they're the most Greek of the Greeks. In fact, their name alone has come down to us and continues to be a name for austerity. We say if we say that somebody lives like a Spartan or lives a Spartan life, we mean he leads an austere life. That was
they did carry it to extreme. And you remember, the Spartan constitution was really the closest to Socrates' ideal.
Yes.
Remember, we talked about this. Right at the heart of the Republic, Socrates proposes a simple state.
Yes.
The Spartan state as opposed to the luxurious.
The luxurious state is what some of the young men that are talking to him, you remember, they got kind of carried away.
City of pigs, they said.
Yeah,
you remember, these Athenians had begun to get a little rich. And in fact, Plato was driving them back to this paragraph.
Well, he had vision. Socrates had vision. He could see the direction of Athens.
They were getting too rich.
Athens was becoming a cosmopolitan city, and there was plenty of luxury, wealth abounded, and he turned his back on that. He himself personally lived a simple and austere life.
Socrates is famous for what? Bare feet. He didn't even wear shoes.
And his simplicity of life. And so he the whole of the Republic is the guardians live that simple life. They live a life, I'm sure we mentioned at the time, a life of poverty. They own no property at all.
It's a monastic life.
It really is a monastic life.
Well, isn't that again true? That is, that the Greeks have contributed to Christianity. The reason for the monastic life. That is, the monastic life is close to Christ. Christ preached poverty. Well, the Greeks reasoned about poverty. That is, why should we be poor? And Cyrus here sees the truth of it, and the Persians, of course, didn't follow Cyrus. Cyrus was the first of these, or among the first, one of the earliest of these great potentates, and his advice was simply not taken.
Cyrus was the greatest of these emperors. He was the first and the wisest of the whole succession of the Persian emperors. And remember, despite what we have said about the Persians, we have not denied them greatness, nor does Herodotus, nor wisdom, especially Cyrus. Cyrus is the one, remember, who rescued Croesus from that burning pyre, and his whole life.
And he rescues Israel too. Yes. in the Bible.
Yeah.
Cyrus is a figure,
yes,
actually, of Christ in the Bible. He is a savior. He does save the.
He's used as an instrument of God
from Babylon,
yeah,
from the Babylonian captivity and destruction.
Yeah.
He permitted the rebuilding of the temple. It is providential. Cyrus is a miracle.
Yeah, I think I mentioned Xenophon's Life of Cyrus. It's a great big book. Xenophon, why he was astonished by Cyrus. You see, because Cyrus did display.
He was almost a Greek.
A lot of Greek qualities. He went all the way to Persia to just like Herodotus, really, that same spirit of the Greek historian. He went there to find out about the way he lived in Persia, to try to find out what kind of a man this Cyrus was, this remarkably wise man.
Well, here's that sentence again. Then Cyrus, who did not greatly esteem the council. Now, what was the council? Well, you're the conquerors. You have the power. Take over the easiest place to live. Let's all go south. We say today. Let's go to the Sun Belt or to California. After all, we have the money, we have the power. We'll all go, where life is plentiful and easy. And Cyrus, who did not like the council, told them they might do so if they liked, but he warned them not to expect, in that case, to continue rulers, but to prepare for being ruled by others. Soft countries give birth to soft men. And the very last phrase is, they should choose rather to dwell in a churlish land and exercise lordship than to cultivate plains and be the slaves of others. There we have that choice between freedom and slavery that we started out with today in our talk. But we can move toward the close here by noting how freedom and slavery is related to economics. That is, riches bring slavery. Gee, that seems like a contradiction. I don't know how Ronald Reagan would take that today. If you went to the government in Washington, especially to the conservatives, to the economists of the conservative camp, and he said to them, the gross national product is not an indication of strength. The richer you get, the closer you are to slavery. What a principle that is. But history bears it out. I don't think there's any question about it. And it bears it out in our personal lives as well. That is, again, remember Socrates says, the state is the soul writ large. If we go into ourselves and ask ourselves this question, does luxury, is luxury good for the moral life? I mean, anybody will tell you that it isn't.
Someone, I think, I can't remember whether I mentioned this here or not, I came across a new word in my reading the other day, although I think it was coined by someone like Max Weber a long time ago. And I think the word is taken from a Greek word, and it's it isn't pleonalgia, pleonexia. Pleonexia, which means, he invented that word, it means the disease of having too much.
The disease of plenty, yeah.
Plenty, yeah. Pleon.
Like anorexia, we have that.
Yeah, the disease of too little. But
this
is the disease of muchness. This was in a book, a rather good book, that's very rarely read, I think, which was a book about what we call the consumerism of our society. This is something that the current Pope has talked about a great deal as an evil of our times. And it's been talked about for a long time. That is that everywhere you look, there's just too much of everything. There's too much to eat and too much to drink and too much to wear. You walk into there's a new up in Canada. There's a new shopping center that's been created there that's something like, I don't know, 1,000 acres.
And it's the most unlikely place.
Yeah, it's way off.
Winnipeg or somewhere.
People go up there, they fly there from the United States, the biggest shopping center in the world. They have 200 restaurants and 55 theaters, and it is a kind of
pleonexia.
Actually, anorexia means a lack of appetite. And this means it's that exia there is the disease. The disease of muchness. I thought the same thing.
No, it's a different root.
Yeah, different root, but it's I think, in fact, anorexia is a kind of reaction against
yes.
I think it's a disease that's a reaction against that. You just say, well, the world is too fat, and everything is too fat.
Well, Jean-Paul Sartre called one of his most famous books, nausea, just means vomit. That is the existentialism of our time in that rotten sense. It was a disgust with life, a surfeit of life. Gee, it is a sickness, isn't it? That vomit, that sense of nausea. That creates, and it's true of states, it's true in the economic order, and it's true in the personal order. Just a couple of weeks ago, I remember on Sunday, a couple of Sundays ago, before Mass, I was reading the epistle, and I was kind of trying to read them over first, so I sort of prepared for it, and read the epistle and the gospel. And the epistle had to do with St. Paul was talking about sin, this being Lent, and he mentioned there were 3 words right in a row there, but there was it was always a hard-hitting letter. I can't remember now which one it was, but he says, you all suffer from, and he said impurity and avarice. And I remember saying to my wife, well, we're going to get a sermon on impurity, but I bet they don't mention avarice. And sure enough, there was no mention. Really, I don't think that today you ever hear a sermon on avarice. That is not considered a sin. It's considered a virtue. It's called free competition and succeeding in the marketplace and ambition and drive and all that.
Success.
But St. Paul, links it just without blinking an eye with the most disgusting of sin.
Well, he said it's he who said avarice is the root of all.
The root of all evil.
The root of all evil. It all begins there. That's an astonishing statement, really. It all begins with this insatiable desire that we have for more.
Now that theme of the small, rugged, austere nation fighting against the luxurious, great nation, that has just been, what are there, 5 or 6 different themes in literature of Western civilization? You can just strike against it anywhere. It's the theme of Shakespeare's Henry V. There it is. The French are a luxurious nation who play tennis.
Yes.
You remember right at the start, and the king harangues his soldiers by saying, "You're Scotsmen. You eat oats. You come from from rugged England, where men live.
This little isle.
Yeah, this little isle, this blessed little isle, blessed because it's little, because it's rugged, because it's austere. And
he praises the army. He says, we're fortunate because there are so few of us. There are a lot of them. He says that we happy few, he says, we're going to be the ones who win.
During World War II, Laurence Olivier made a movie out of that play, Shakespeare's Henry V, and that movie was the literary event of World War II. That is, it inspired. I can remember people saying, "Oh, there's no place for literature. We have to go to war now. Let's dump Shakespeare." And my golly, he turned around and said, "No. Shakespeare is what we need at this moment because he will recall to us the mettle of our pastures." He said, "We'll show them the mettle of our pastures." Well, I just pulled that one out of a hat, but you can take a million of them.
If you want the negative side of it, you can take a later play of Shakespeare's, that is Antony and Cleopatra, which is very close to the material we're dealing with. That is, there is the luxury, especially the luxury of the East. Cleopatra is the everlasting symbol of the luxury of the East and how it corrupted Mark Antony, who was himself a very great man. A man of great power and great intelligence and great ability.
And even austerity until then.
Yes, he was capable of great austerity, but he was completely corrupted and ruined by the East.
That word luxury has to do, of course, with sins of sex in its medieval meaning, but it also has to do with this plenty, this
excess. Yes.
And Cleopatra had both. She was luxurious in both. Exactly. The barge. She sat in like a burnished throne, burned on the waters, and poor Anthony was gone.
Yeah,
he was absolutely gone. They start down from there. Yes, and that theme of the few, the rugged few, isn't that the story of the United States in the War of Independence? the redcoats were, at that time England had become a luxurious nation.
Yes, they were.
George Washington at Valley Forge with his handful of cold and freezing men. And again, the rugged countryside of the Allegheny Mountains, or especially New England, this stern and rock-bound coast.
Yeah, well, the Spartans, again, you must realize the Spartans lived in the southernmost part of Greece, which is the most inhospitable part of Greece. Well, the whole place is rather inhospitable. We took some students there one time, and you can read about places like that, but you don't really realize what they're like unless you go there. There's a famous line in I think it's in the Iliad, where they talk about Ithaca as being a rugged place, but a good nurse of men. That's the phrase. A very rugged place, and it is. We went to Ithaca, and oh well, it's just one great big mountain. Ithaca is, but that's where Odysseus came from, or Sparta. It's all mountainous. We didn't even go there, because they said to us, well, there isn't anything to see there. It's just all mountains, and our bus drivers don't like to go there, and their bus drivers weren't afraid of anything.
Go anywhere else.
Yeah, but they didn't want to go down there. They said, oh, you don't want to go down there. They said, there's nothing to see. You see, the Spartans didn't build great buildings. There are no ruined temples down there. They didn't do that. They lived very simple lives. They didn't build stone buildings and monuments. They were a soldiering race that lived by choice in the most remote and rough part of Greece.
And if you strike across history, you'll find this just again and again and again. In the stories of the Middle Ages, like the Song of Roland, there you have the rugged French fighting against the Asiatic hordes of the luxurious Mohammedans. And if you read the novels, the romances of Sir Walter Scott, Scotland, of course, is the very emblem of Sparta.
Exactly.
They eat oats, and they're Highlanders, and they live in their kilts, sleep out all night in the cold. And these are the stalwart men. And as we said, we find it in the stories of of America. That is the George Washington and the fight against the despotic and luxurious Europe. So it's a story that has been told again and again. We can link these things together: the discovery of reason, the discovery of simplicity of justice. These are the things that Herodotus binds his history together with. And that last paragraph will stand perhaps as maybe the moral of the whole story. It gets down to an aphorism: soft countries give birth to soft men. Certainly a lesson that we in the United States are going to have to face today. Why did we lose the Vietnamese War? Well, the tables have been turned on us. They were the austere people living on rice in the jungles. Those gooks, they said, in a foot-long piece of bamboo, they could stow rations for a week, whereas we had
they'd fly in, steaks. They'd buy helicopter for barbecues. Coca-Cola by the case, by the truckload.
We have become the glutted and the luxurious nation. It was the Vietnamese who defeated us by their austerity. What are we to do about this? Well, Thoreau was the one who said what we were to do: simplify. That is, if we are to act on this in our own lives personally, and if it's at all possible politically, what we have to do is go back to basic principles, go back to the beginning. And the beginning, surely one of the beginnings, is a simple economic life. As preposterous as that may seem today, in this glut of economic thinking about expansion and new inventions and more technology, there has always been a small body of specifically Catholic social doctrine, which almost nobody pays any attention to anymore. It was championed by Leo XIII, of course, and by in our British tradition by those marvelous Spartans. Fat Spartans, Belloc and Chesterton. That is the basis of a Christian economy would have to be, I almost hesitate to say it, small farming, small craftsmanship. Nobody's going to listen to that, I'm afraid.
We have had,
but it's there. It's there.
We have. There have been, of course. This is something that's rather in the air. This criticism. We're not the only ones who say this. That is, when you use the word small, I have to think of the book that was such a great success. Small is beautiful.
That's a Chestertonian book.
It is a Chestertonian book, and it did surprise everyone by how successful it was. How people, it became a sort of rallying point. A whole generation was very much influenced by that book, and of course he was a man who had been what was his name? I always forget it. Shoemaker. Shoemaker.
I want to say shoemaker. That's the jockey Schumacher.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
They're both very great men, but Schumacher.
Yeah, Schumacher was a man who was the president of the British National Coal Board, one of the vastest kind of industrial empires.
It's on beyond coal. It's one of those multinational industries.
Yeah. And he said, he used the Greek approach to the thing. He says, well, this doesn't work. This isn't a successful way of running a business. He said, this won't work. You can't go on like this. He said, and he did. He broke the business down. He broke it down into smaller units where people had some responsibility for their own work. He said one of the things that happens in these vast structures is that nobody's responsible. And no one takes any pride in what they do. So he reorganized that coal industry, and he improved it. He made it a better, more efficient organization. And he said, well, that could be done everywhere in our society. And there have been other people. I've noticed quite a few books written by people on this theme. One of them was not a great book at all, and it's just a sign of the times, of a man who said, the great era of prosperity is over. It's finished, and it will never return. And he had a convincing argument. He said, we had this tremendous boom after World War II, but that's not going to happen again. People think, well, if we just keep working at it, we're going to get back to that high level of prosperity that everybody enjoyed right after World War II. But he said that's not going to happen. We're going to have to go back to a simpler way of life. I think there's a great deal in what he said.
You remember about a century ago, there was a book that became very famous, at least among intellectuals. I don't know if it was a bestseller, but the intellectuals considered it to be the springboard Theory of the Leisure Class by Thorstein Veblen. And the doctrine there was that industrialism would introduce us into a world where nobody would ever have to work again, where we would just have everything we wanted. In other words, he celebrated the idea of glut. That's really what he did. Mm-hmm. And how many of the utopias celebrated that? Those popular novels that projected us into the future. Like H.G. Wells' book and Edward Bellamy, and especially Bellamy. Yes, that everything would be just wonderful. Why we would have radios and television sets, and then everybody would be happy. And we now do see that is simply not true. Now the science fiction or utopian literature is all going into the opposite extreme. That is, they're predicting disaster and that we're going to go back to the desert. Now, what Herodotus is proposing here is not the jungle, not the desert, a decent way of life. Chaucer, our great poet, put it in that perfect phrase, glad poverty. That is, let's distinguish poverty from destitution. When Herodotus here, through Cyrus, celebrates the austere life, he's not celebrating a life of starvation and misery. He's talking about exactly what Chaucer meant by glad poverty. That is a decent way of life, but small and spartan. And that is true of that really is the core of what used to be called Catholic social doctrine, which Schumacher rediscovered in a book called Small is Beautiful. But as I say, you don't hear much in the way of preaching on it. And what a connection there is between these two things. That is, this life on the level of society, and as Socrates said, the analogy between that and the life on the level of the person. We see about us today conspicuous immorality everywhere. As the family has gone, the most disgusting kinds of behavior are tolerated, and you very seldom get the connection between that and pleonexia.
Yeah, well, you certainly see it in Socrates. Again, you go back to the Republic, and what happened. The reason he explains why is it, he says, that the question is raised: why does each successive stage of government, which is parallel, of course, to the stage in one's own personal life, in the individual, why is there this tendency toward retrogression? And he says, well, it's success. Now, what he means by that is simply that in the highest kind of society, that is, in the republic, in the aristocracy, when it's successful, the guardian class becomes weak. After all, they're so strong and they're so successful that their enemies are afraid to attack them, and they have order within the society. And so they say, well, why do we have to be strong anymore? We can take it easy. We can relax now. And then when the next kind of society comes along, the democracy, once again, it's a long-lived kind of society based on tradition. But eventually, when it finally does succeed, then the next generation of the sons of these people, well, they become soft, and so it is. And then it's even worse with the next generation. That is the business men, the capitalists, the practical man who really is the man who wants to make money. It's even worse there. That is you get Henry Ford in that next generation, but his son is nothing like.
He goes to Harvard.
Yeah. He goes to Harvard, and he doesn't have any of that strength and that vigor that the old man had. And that's, I think we said this at the time. That's where we are now. And the next stage is Socrates' democracy, which is not freedom, of course.
Choose rather to dwell in a churlish land, exercise lordship, than to cultivate plains and be the slaves of others.
And we get then you get the slavery of democracy, and ultimately.
Well, isn't that what we have now? Especially, we see it, of course, among college students, because after all, we're associated with them. That's our job. But it's everywhere. College students are, after all, the citizens of the next generation.
Yeah. And what, supposedly the leaders.
And what is it that characterizes the most now? And I must say, in my judgment, it would be the slave mentality.
Yeah, it's in the mind, you see. It's not just in the body. It's not just a softness of the body. It's a softness of the mind.
You ask them what they want. They want security. They don't want even to be rich. They don't want to be Henry Ford.
No. They don't want to make $1 million. They don't want to be J. Paul Getty. They want to be someone who just has something very comfortable, with a nice pension to look forward to in the future, where they can retire into really an easy life. They don't think about hard work. I know occasionally I'll talk to some one of the merchants in town. I was talking to the man who takes care of my car, and he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "I interview some of those kids sometimes from the college," and he says, the first thing they want to know about is our retirement plan, and he says they don't know anything. They don't know anything. They can't do anything at all, but they think they look forward to retirement. But of course, it's as students that I see this especially. And it's not even sloth exactly. It's a kind of sloth of mind.
I think it's a slave mentality. It's on beyond sloth. We used to preach against sloth, saying that was the besetting sin of students, but I think it's changed.
Yeah, I think it is too. I put it often simply in terms of conventionality. That is, they're so content to simply take whatever the prevailing view is, and and it doesn't matter what it is, they won't rise above that conventional view so frequently. They won't make the effort to consider, to think about things, to consider. They simply take whatever the latest slogan is. They fall back into that, and that is slavery. Of course, that is the media is the instrument of slavery, are the instruments of slavery, and that many people have said that, but it certainly there's a lot of truth in it.
So let's go back to a churlish land. That's a marvelous phrase.
Yeah, well, the churlish land is still out there. I've got a student right now. I have a student right this minute who I just talked to him today, and boy, he wants to get out of here. He says, the only thing I'm afraid of is that it may be gone before I get there. He says, and I said, oh, it'll still be here. He said, no, it's going. He said, it's going and he's a guy who he's gone off looking for it,
What does he want to find? A piece of land?
Not a piece of land. He wants to wander.
He wants to find adventure.
Yeah, he wants to find adventure. He's going to Asia. He's going up into the Himalaya mountains to find it, because he says, well, there isn't all this darn technology there. He wants to free himself from it. He wants to live a free life. That's really what he wants. And he also says, well, there's religion there. He doesn't have any